Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for the first beer school here on Twitch that I've ever done. My name is Andrew Mason, aka Brewer A, and joined with me this week is my number one favorite Twitch affiliate variety streamer, Chewy Don.
Oh,
Please tell us a little bit about yourself, real quick.
yeah, I'm a moron on the internet having a good time for everyone to see. So, hi. Thanks for
I
having me here.
I'm very glad to have you and all of your streams viewers here with us. Look at the shout outs. Oh, my brother's in chat, shoots in chat. We're just blowing up left and right. So the idea here with beer school, I've done this a number of times before for friends. I've brewed beer for about 12 years now, and
Okay.
a lot of people have very strange ideas about what beer is or how beer is made or what beer is all about. And so for this inaugural episode, what I wanted to do was like Beer 101. So we're going to go through um, the ingredients of beer, how beer is made, and then a little bit of Q&A if we get any from chat, and then hopefully if we have enough interest, what I want to do for this in future streams. And then, because obviously we're on Twitch, I want to end the stream with a little bit of beer and video game chat.
Gotcha.
So,
So you're gonna tell me about the mash that goes into beer, right?
we are going to be. So, the first thing is first. Do you know, or can you tell me, what the four main ingredients of beer are?
Water.
There's only four. Water is one, and very important.
Okay,
Of course, when you only have four ingredients, every ingredient is important. But yeah,
that's right.
water
I'm
is
gonna say
one.
grain.
Grain, we'll call it yeah, grain, but in this case we'll call it malt. And
Malt.
we'll get
Okay.
into the details of that a little bit later. But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Yeast.
yeast is number three.
And I'm gonna guess on this one sugar.
Well, we're going to be getting sugar mainly from the malt. But we need
Okay.
one very special ingredient to turn all of these things into beer because
Okay.
independently, well, we already have yeast, but we need some. The yeast is going to turn the sugars into alcohol and CO2. But if we just had fermented sugar water, it would taste basically all like pop. So we need one more ingredient.
Okay. I'm out. I
Okay,
don't know.
it's hops.
Ah,
So,
let's see. I didn't know if that was in the grain category or not.
oh,
So,
okay. So we have water, we have malt, we have hops, and we have yeast. Four main ingredients.
okay.
Obviously, you
Okay.
can have lots of other ingredients to flavor and change your beer, but those are the four that you really need to have to make a beer.
Okay.
Excuse me. So, first things first. I've got some pictures to explain some beer. So let's see if this is going to work.
All right.
Look at
Picture
that.
time,
Look
chat.
at that transition. Everything worked right away. Okay, so um, this is a picture of a malt house. But actually, even before we get to the malt house, what we need to do is
Wow.
talk about
Look at it.
water. Let me see if I can navigate to water. So, when it comes to water, water's water, right? Well,
Right.
it's not because um,
Oh.
in this
Oh,
case,
sorry.
yeah, that was a trick question. In this case, let me see if I can. No, that's not it. Okay, so water. Oh, that's why because it does. Windows 10 and the navigating. Okay, open with photo viewer.
Hey, man. First session.
I know we're getting there. All right, let's switch over
This
to.
is this is a refined art. The people who do this on a weekly basis, I'll never understand because it's so many moving pieces,
All
so
right,
much
here
you
we
have
go.
to get.
We're doing much better now. Okay, so water, in general, is not something that a lot of people consider when they're first talking about beer or thinking about beer. But
Okay.
your hardness profile and the minerals that are in your water are going to greatly affect the way um, that your end beer is going to taste. So
Okay.
when you talk about different water sources around the world, some very famous ones are like in England, Burton-on-Trent is an area that has a really high calcium sulfate, or gypsum, basically, and that changes the way the hops interact with the beer. London has really high carbonate, and it ends up extracting more color from the malts. Pilsen in the Czech Republic is very low mineral content water. And then, like if you go to Munich, they have a different water, and the alkalinity and everything else affects the ingredients in different ways to give you different water profiles. This image that we're looking at right now is from a book by a guy named Stan Hieronymus, who is a buddy and who is a great beer writer. He has a blog called Appalachian Beer Blog that I will actually post a link in chat if anybody would like to go see it. But he's written a number of books. He's a super great guy, and this is an excerpt from a book that he wrote called Brew Like a Monk, explaining the different hardness and the different profiles from some different Belgian brewers. Some very famous Belgian breweries: Westmalle, Orval, Roquefort, Chimay, Achel, Westvleteren. And you can see that these numbers are all over the place, but the reason that they ended up brewing specific kinds of beers in these areas is because their water profiles were just naturally in a certain way, and the kinds of beers that they would make, or the beers that they eventually made, are beers that benefited from this specific water profile. So in modern times, for us, this isn't super important because we can modify our water any way that we want when we brew beers. We can do reverse osmosis water, take all the mineral content out, and then add back whatever minerals that we want to emphasize, maybe different yeast or different hops or malt character. And most of that is all coming from your mineral content in your beers. So in our case, or in my case, with the beer that the water that we use, the brewery that I work at, comes from Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is a really great water source, and it has a really nice kind of even mineral content. We don't have to modify it too much when we brew. Hey Kev. And it's the main reason why the German immigrants that came and moved to Milwaukee opened up breweries in Milwaukee and then around the Great Lakes area, because the water is just a really great profile.
Okay.
So typically now, unless you are on a well water or you have water that has just really bad character, you're not going to have to modify your water too much, but it is a very important consideration when you're opening a brewery, where you're going to source your water from. And then on top of that, if you're going to modify it, or if you want to add certain minerals and stuff back to it, if you're making a specific kind of beer. And even now, when you go to Germany, a lot of very traditional German breweries will have a picture on their label or some type of signage about how they have this amazing spring water source, or they have these aquifers that are right underneath the brewery. And it's a very old school traditional German way of talking about their water. So
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So water's number one. Malt is number two, which you already had mentioned is grain. And the main difference between the two is that grain is is basically the form of a cereal grain when it's coming out of the field. So what we need to do we can't just take. Thank you for the follow. What we need to do is take the grain from the field, and we need to turn it into malt. And the process that we're going to do that is in a malt house. And the reason that we need to do it is because we can't just take raw malt and put it in the beer. We're not going to be able to get the starches to convert it into sugars, and the yeast is not going to eat it up. So we need to take that grain, and we need to get it ready for the enzymes that are naturally occurring in the grain to break down the starches and to turn those into sugars, because what we're basically trying to do is make sugar water, boil it, and then have the yeast eat it up. So the very first thing we do in a malt house is to, let me see if we can, here's an outside picture of a malt house that I went to that's about halfway between Milwaukee and Madison, and I don't even know if it's actually functioning anymore, but it had functioned for a very long time, since the 1800s. And I think it might have been sold and shut down at this point. But this was called Jefferson Junction. It was an enormous malt house. All of these individual concrete pillars are grain elevators, basically. So they have tons and tons of space. And so what they do, they have these enormous vats. And what we need to do is soak the grain because we're basically trying to get it ready for the germination process. So the grain goes into these enormous tubs, and this is specifically, this is barley. Most of the grain that makes up beer is barley, and malted barley makes up 99 or more % of the grain that we use to make beers. The other notable ones are generally wheat, or for the really big breweries that are trying to make more lighter flavored beers, rice or corn. And when we talk about other malted grains other than barley, we refer to them as adjuncts. So if you're making a large malt bill with adjuncts, you're going to be using rice or corn or some other kind of cereal grain that is not barley, generally speaking.
So for an example, that would be like a Blue Moon or something like that?
Sure. That's a generally speaking, that's a or loosely speaking, that's a in the style of a Belgian wheat beer. So it has a large portion of wheat for the malt bill. It still uses barley, and barley is going to be the majority of that. But you're going to be adding wheat to supplement that barley to give you a little bit different of a malt character. So
I see. Okay.
So in this picture, this is a giant vat that has unmalted barley in it, and it's going to get soaked with water. So here's a picture of the barley being completely saturated and having air bubble up through it. And they're trying to get it completely saturated so that it can basically get sent to the germination phase. So once the barley is wet and it's been soaked, they get dumped out into these huge long beds, and you can see this really long gear bed along the side here. There's a arm that goes through and continuously rotates the barley and completely turns it over. And this is you can see it's a little hazy in this room. It's really warm and humid, and they're just trying to get the barley to just start the germination phase.
Okay.
So this is what it looks like when it comes straight out of those soaking vessels, and it's in big tubs. And then they have the arm come down and spread it all out and continuously turn it over. So this gets rotated so it's all even. And this is super, super, super long beds. So this is barley that has just been sprouted. You can see that there's little like rootlets starting to form on it. So right when it gets to this point, you don't want it to go any farther because it's going to start to sprout into a plant. So when it gets to this point, it goes to the kilns, and we halt the germination process by pushing steam through it. So at this point, the barley's been malted. And I just squeezed one of these little kernels. You can see the starchy part right in the middle. The starchy part in the middle of any kind of grain is called the endosperm, and the endosperm is what we're trying to get converted from starches into sugars. And then this is a kernel that fell out of the bed, and the maltster that was showing us around was pointing out the fact that this is extremely highly modified barley, meaning that as soon as it gets to the germination phase, it's ready to grow, and it means that it has lots of enzymes that are in it that are really good for converting those starches into sugars, and it's ready to go as soon as it hits germination phase. And the reason that's important is that in basically in the olden days, as it were, the grain, a lot of brewers would actually do the malting themselves. They would get raw grain from a farmer or whatever, and they would have maltings on their brewery premises, and they would be in charge of turning the barley into malt. And because you had a lot less scientific control over what you were making, and you didn't have technical instruments and whatever, you would end up doing a little bit of this malting process in the brew house itself, and you would have to go through all kinds of different temperature steps to try to get the malt to do what you wanted. But in this case, this is modern barley that has been bred and grown in a certain way so that as soon as it's malted, it's ready to go and make beer. So Once the grain is dried out, so we're going to take it from this step. We're going to take it to the kiln, and we need to get all that water out of it because brewers want to buy malt. They don't want to buy water. So they need to take all that water out, and they kiln it, and they dry it. And then that very plain, dried out malt is the basis for most of the beers that are made. And this is either going to be turned into pale ale malt or Pilsner malt. And those are two very light colored, light flavored malts. So from this point, there are dozens and dozens of different flavors that you can get from malted barley. And in general, you're getting like bakery flavors from malt. You're getting toffee, bready, toasty, roasty, nutty, chocolate, coffee. All of those characters that you might get come from treating base malted barley in different ways by adding different amounts of heat to it or putting it in a drum roaster, or in some cases they like stew it and then dry it out, and you get all these different really amazing different characteristics. And there are dozens and dozens of different kinds of malts. So
Okay.
You have like magazines and magazines of different kinds. You have caramel malts, you have crystal malts, you have like I said, roasted malts that can be chocolate or black or coffee flavored or brown. There's just there's so much different variety that you can get from them, but you're going to be getting basically bakery flavors from your malt. So once we get to the brewery, let me see if I can jump over to a picture of what a brew house looks like. So this is my brew house at work. We have this is actually an older photo, but right now currently we have 5 brewing vessels. In this photo we have 4 brewing vessels. So the very first step is, once we figured out what our recipe is going to be, we have the first vessel here is called a mash kettle. So the mash kettle is where we're going to be taking all of our grist bill. So we look at our recipe. Basically, if you're going to be making like a cake, your pale malt or your Pilsner malt, the pale colored stuff, is going to be your flour in your cake. That's going to make up the most of the recipe for your beer. And then if you want to add spices or color, you're going to be using a little bit amount of those specialty malts. Like if you're going to make a stout, most of what you're using is pale colored malt, but you're going to be adding a portion of dark colored malt to give you the color and to give you the flavor. So we crush all that. We crush all that up because we need to now that the malt's been dried back out again, it's very crisp and dry. So we need to crack that open. We need to get to the center. So we put it through a mill. And that also separates the outside of barley kernel has a husk on it, and we want that husk to act as a natural filter for us. So we crack open the grain, it gets to the starch in the middle, and it also separates the husk to basically add as a filter material. So we mix it all up in the mash kettle, and depending on the temperature that you mix it up at, the enzymes turn on automatically. They're temperature activated basically, and between about 142 degrees and 165 degrees they'll get turned on. And hey Giggle, and if you turn them on at a very low level, they make very simple sugars. And the simple sugars, thank you for the follow. So the simple sugars, the reason that this is important is that the yeast is going to eat up those sugars. And if you have simple sugars, it's very easy for the yeast to eat up the sugars. And if you have long chain complex sugars, I'm going to have to get used to hearing that follow noise in my ears and not keep talking. So if you have long chain complex sugars, it's much harder for the yeast to break down all those sugars. So you end up with residual sugar in your beer, and that's what gives your beer body. So if you mash in at a low temperature, you make simple sugars, and it's much easier for the yeast to consume all that. And it's going to not leave a lot of residual sugar behind. But if you mash in at a higher temperature, you're going to make long chain sugars that are harder for the yeast to break down, and you're going to have residual sugar in the beer.
Hmm.
excuse me, that gives you your body. So if you have a beer that's really thick tasting and has a big body, it's likely because there's a lot of residual sugar in the beer. So yeah,
And when you say body, you're talking like heaviness on the tongue, kind of that weighted sensation in your mouth.
yeah,
It's
basically. So
kind of equated to coffee.
kind of like if you are drinking a very simple light beer, like a Miller Lite or Bud Light or something like that. It's very
Hmm.
thin. It's very thin tasting. There's not a lot of body to it. But if you
Hmm.
have a beer like Giggle mentioned, he in chat, Giggle says bottled my Baltic Porter today, one with coffee added. So a Baltic Porter is likely going to be a very big bodied beer with residual sugar. It's going to be chewy. You're going to really know that you have something in your mouth when you're having a big bodied beer.
I
And
see.
that's all determined on the temperature that you get those starches converted into sugars, and that's the most important thing that happens in the mash tun. So you're basically making like uh, a big like porridge. Basically,
Okay.
you're mixing up crust grain with hot water, and you're letting that rest so that the enzymes can turn the starches into sugars. So what we do after that is we ramp the temperature up because we want those enzymes to stop doing their work once they convert everything. So we heat it up to about 170 or 172 degrees, and then we push it over to the next vessel. And the next one is called a lauter tun, and lauter is the German word to separate. So we just mixed up this basically this like porridge, but we don't want all of those solids to get into our beer. We just want the sugar water. So we need to
Hmm.
separate the what is called wort, WORT. That sweet malty liquid. We need to separate that from the mash. So we use a lauter tun, which if you could see a cross section of this vessel, what you would see is some big rakes on the inside to slowly move the grain around, and then on the bottom there are screens that have really thin slits in them, so it lets the liquid go through, but it doesn't let any solids go through.
Okay.
So we mix everything up, um, and we pump it over to the lauter tun. And the lautering usually takes somewhere between an hour and 10 and an hour and a half, or sometimes on bigger beers, about 2 hours to separate all the liquid. And then we also spray hot water on the top to rinse all those sugars out. So uh,
Sure.
in about an hour and a half or 2 hours, we've collected all of the sugar water that we need, all of our wort, and we're ready to boil that. So once we're done, all of that mash gets pumped out. In our case, it goes to a farmer and he feeds it to his cows. But that
Nice.
gets pumped out into a big vessel outside, and then that goes out, yeah, to farm to pigs or whatever, and pigs or cows. And I remember one time actually, I was on the Budweiser tour in St. Louis, and they said something to the effect that Anheuser's spent grain accounts for like 4 or 5% of all the grain consumed by livestock in the U.S., which seems like a really small number, but when you consider how much livestock we have and how much grain that must
Yeah,
be, it's a pretty insane amount of grain.
absolutely.
So we've separated, we've run off all of our wort into our kettle, and now we've gotten to a boil, and we need to get to our next ingredient um, because we haven't talked about hops yet. So
Hmm.
hops are the flowering cone of a climbing vine, and they are, let's see, there we go. This is a cross section of a bale of hops. So hops grow on what are called bines with a B, and
Hmm.
they are green and they are leafy and they look like little pine cones basically. I want to see if I can find a close-up photo of one. You can see this; these are in a big pile. Um, there we go. So they look like little green pine cones, and they have just like you get bakery flavors from hops, you get garden flavors from. I'm sorry, bakery flavors from malt. You get garden flavors from hops. So that can be citrusy, piney, um, floral, earthy. There's a whole wide range that you can get from different varieties of hops, depending on what kind of hop they are and where they were grown and the conditions that they were grown in. And there's all kinds of different factors that go into um, how they end up smelling and tasting in your beer. But hops have essential oils and acids in them, and they are what gives your beer bitterness. So those acids that are in the beer are actually very difficult to dissolve from the hop cone into your liquid. So we boil the beer for generally an hour to an hour and a half to get that bitterness from the hops into the beer. And
Okay.
depending on when you add your hops and how much bittering potential your hops have, depend on when you're going to add your hops. But also, in addition to the bittering component, they also have aromatic properties. But just like if you're going to make a dish at home and you're going to add spices, if you add all of your spices right at the beginning, it's not going to be very aromatic. Um, it's going to all volatilize off when you're cooking your dish or boiling or whatever. So, um, if you want hop aroma and flavor, you add those later in your boil so that you don't boil all of those properties off. So, in this picture that we're looking at right now, this is a number of years ago when I was out at what we call Hop Selection. Actually, let's see. Can we see crop year? So that was 2010. So that was actually a number of years ago. Um,
Is this when you seized an underground cartel's hop stash?
I know it looks like that, right? So if you actually look at this picture right here, you can see that these are little pellets that look kind of like bunny food. The form that we primarily use our hops in are those pelletized hops. They take the hops and they run them through a hammer mill and turn them into a powder, and then they put them through dyes and they put them in the little pellets. And the pellets store much better and they're much easier to use. But when we do selection, so we write contracts every year for the varieties of hops and the volume of hops that we need. But then at the around September, we fly out to Yakima, Washington, which is where most of the hops in the U.S. are grown. They do grow some in Idaho and they grow some in Washington State, but Yakima Valley is where they grow most of the hops in the U.S. It's the high desert plain, and it has really great growing conditions. They grow all kinds of agriculture. It's actually second only to what's the famous valley in California where they grow all the food.
I want to say Yucca. Is
Mm,
that correct?
it's like a more general valley even than that, or area, like the agricultural part
Uh,
of California. Anyway,
Basically all of Central California.
yeah, basically all of Central California. But Yakima's second only to that in terms of produce. They grow tons of apples there, all kinds of different fruit, grapes, but they also grow hops. So
Oh wow.
um, when we go to fill our contracts in the fall, we will have contracts written for a certain variety. You can see in this picture, this says Centennial right here. So Centennial is one of the C hops that have generally very piney and citrusy characters to it. So we have all of these different lots to choose from, and they take samples from the bales of hops and give us what they would consider a representative sample from certain lots. And then we evaluate those hops and rub them to choose what we're going to fill our contracts with. But when they're processing the hops, I think it's super cool. So we can go through the processing step real quick. So out in the field, this is what hops look like when they're growing out in the field. So they have these really tall poles that are about 20 feet tall, and they have strings that run down, and the hops grow in these trellises, and you can see the cones on the vines right there. But they have rows and rows and rows and rows of these. So in the fall, once the hops are harvested, let's go back to the beginning here. Um, this processing facility that we were at actually has a little bit older technology, and I'll show you some other newer ones too. But this truck has the guys go along and they cut the tops off of the strings, and then they just have these long strings of hops basically in the back of the truck, and then they get fed into. In this case, they tied the strings to this like chain conveyor, and they get fed into the pickers. And in this case, the picker is kind of they have these fingers and they spin around real fast and they knock the hops off of the vines, and then they fall down into this conveyor, and the conveyor feeds up into separators because you don't want all the leaves and the stems and
Right.
the strings and all that stuff fed into the hops. So they have these roll tables that spin and they tumble, and the hop cones are a little bit heavier, so they keep falling end over end, and then the leaf matter and stuff falls down and they get separated, and they just go over and over and over again until it gets cleaned up. So eventually, they also go to a kiln because just like we don't want to buy water from malt, we don't want to buy. Thank you for the host, Giggle. We don't want to buy water in our hops, but more importantly,
Right.
for hops, they're very fragile. So too much water, they will mold very easily. But hops are also very dangerous because
Okay.
if they're too dry, they often, or they not often, but they will spontaneously combust. So the moisture,
What?
yeah, the moisture level is really important, and they have to keep a really close eye on the moisture level during this entire process. So if you ever, I know not many people ever go to Yakima, but if you ever get the opportunity to visit a hop processing facility, it's really amazing because the smell is just completely overwhelming. This, it's almost like walking into like a weed grow because they smell, they're in the same family. Hops are in the cannabis family.
Oh,
But
really?
instead of, cannabis sativa or whatever else, it's cannabis humulus lupulus. So, they're cousins, basically. So if you ever get to go to a hop kiln or a hop processing facility, it's really incredible because it's just totally overwhelming. But they have these long beds, just like when they're making malt. But they're blowing hot air up through the bottom to try to dry the hops out to a very specific moisture percentage. So they have these really cool conveyors that go from the pickers. They get fed down here, and then they have this arm that goes back and forth, and it feeds the hops onto these beds, and then they get dried out. And it takes a couple hours. And then once the hops are dried, they get put into these enormous piles of hops, and they get fed into a baler, which this is what a baler looks like. And this is basically a rectangle with an enormous hydraulic press on it. So they get fed into here, they get smushed down into these giant bales like this, and then they get sewn up, and then they can do all kinds of sampling from these bales. Because generally speaking, from the baler, they go into the coolers because the pelletization process takes a long time, and mostly they just want to get the hops baled, and then later in the fall or into the winter they'll go through the pelletization process. But it's really important, just like in the grape harvest, they need to get everything out of the field as soon as possible. When hops are ready, they need to get them out of the field and kilned and baled as soon as possible, so that the really good characteristics that you've chosen in the field don't denigrate, and you want to get them dried out, and you don't want them to get moldy or have pests, or there's all sorts of problems that can happen. So hops are super fragile.
Sure.
So they want to
Gotcha.
get them baled and processed as soon as possible. So they have these giant balers, and then this variety right here is Amarillo, and they have all kinds of different codes on it and whatever. This picture is from a newer hop picker. Instead of having fingers that spin around and knock the hops off, this is from a manufacturer and a hop growing family called Peralt. And this is their new picker. And it has like this, I wouldn't call it a chainsaw, but it has these teeth that move back and forth, and it actually cuts the bines up into little pieces. So it's a little bit, in their opinion, more gentle on the hop cones, since you don't have something like smashing at the cones and knocking them off. It just cuts them into,
Tumbling them around. And...
So, and they basically, I wouldn't say a salad spinner, but they cut it into little pieces, and it makes it easier for them to process their hops. So,
Sure.
and then they have this tumbler, and the hops go on, and the other stuff falls down, and it's really cool to see. It's extremely loud, but like I said, if you ever get to see hops getting processed, it's definitely something to check out. But you can see these enormous, like football field long beds of hops that they're processing, and they're drying them out, and it's extremely humid in there, just like in a malt house, but it's humid not because they're adding water, but because they've got hot air blowing up throughout and taking the moisture out of it.
Right.
So this is the side view of that bale or the lot sample from the beginning. You can see the compressed, this is from a bale, so you can see all the cones are squished together. And this yellow stuff that's in the middle is the lupulin glands, and that's where most of the alpha acids and the essential oils are in the hop plant, and that's what gives you your really nice oils and your flavors and your aromas. So when we're selecting these hops, um, let's see, Giggle asks, for home processed hops, should you do something or just put it in the freezer? The hops that I grow in my backyard, Giggle, I pick them and I dry them on newspaper and then leave them on the newspaper for like a day or two. And as soon as they're dry, I put them in a Ziploc baggie and squeeze them as tight as I can so there's no air in them. Or you could use one of those vacuum sealers and then just stick them in the freezer and they'll keep for quite a while. You can, as long as they don't get freezer burned, depending on your freezer, you can have those for, a year or more. Professionally processed hops you can keep in a freezer pelletized for 5 years or more without any kind of denigration. So they last quite a while if you store them correctly. But when we're doing selection, the way that we do it is to take a sample of these of this bale sample, and then you rub it in your hands really hard because you're heating up those oils, and then you go through and you just evaluate, just like you see Jim Cook from the Sam Adams commercials doing, where he's getting his nose in there and smelling them. You're going through all these different lots and you're smelling for off flavors or for what you think is most true to the variety. You want to make sure there's not like any onion garlic character in there, like they were left out growing too long. Often when hops grow too long, they start to get a onion or garlic or diesel character, which is really unpleasant. Giggle asks, how do you test your home hops for acidity? There's not really a way at all to do it at home because you have to. We do it at work in the lab, but you have to use some really nasty chemicals and you have to process them in a certain way. And then you have to take that and put them in a special lab instrument. So, Kev says just use a pool strip. So at home, there's not really a very easy way to test. Generally speaking, I would say just go off of like a commercial chart and assume that your acidity is going to be a little bit lower because you're generally not, the hops that you grow at home are generally not in ideal conditions. Typically, I would not even use homegrown hops for bittering. I would mostly just use them for aroma because you can determine your aroma. You just rub the hop and know whether or not it smells nice. And I would use it for a late addition in a boil or for a dry hop. But for bittering, I would typically use something that you buy commercially just because you can know exactly what it is. All right, so if we go back to our boil, we've selected our hops, so we've gotten our sugar water. Let me just do a quick review. We've got our boil kettle filled with sugar water. Hey, Roto, thanks for saying hello. We've got a boil kettle full essentially of sugar water of our wort, and it's at boil now, and so we need to get our bitterness into the beer. So once we reach boil, we're going to add our hops, our bittering addition of hops. We're going to boil it for generally an hour to an hour and a half, depending on your brew house and how efficient it is and how well it strips out volatiles and how intense the boil is. There's all kinds of different variations of different brew houses and brewing and boil systems. But like I said, the hops that we're going to add at the beginning are going to be for bitterness. And then at the very end of the boil or towards the end of the boil, we'll add hops for flavor because all that flavor won't volatilize off if it just boils for a short amount of time. And then the hops that we are going to add at the very end are going to be mostly be for aroma. And then typically from once the boil's done, after an hour and a half, you're going to pump that entire volume of bitter sugar water into another vessel called a whirlpool. And the purpose of the whirlpool is to, which I'm not even sure if you can see it terribly well in our picture, but let me pull it up real quick. A whirlpool. Yeah, in this photo you can't see super well, but this is our boil kettle, or our old boil kettle, and then there's the other vessel that's just in the background is our whirlpool. And it doesn't have any screens or anything special in it. It just has a inlet that is on a tangent. So if you imagine a circle, your whirlpool inlet is going to come in on an angle, and it's going to pump the wort in, and it's going to go counterclockwise, and all of the proteins that are broken out during the boil and all of the hops that we've added are going to collect in the center. Because just like if you have like a cup of like coffee with loose grounds in it or tea with loose tea in it, if you spin it with your spoon, all of that stuff's going to collect in the center. And the point of that is that we don't want all of those solids to get into our fermentation vessels, which is where the beer is going to go after that. And then real quick,
Okay.
Giggle asks, dry hop with unprocessed hops that's not turned into pellets sounds like a good idea, but it's not clean. Um, Generally speaking, it's not an issue because hops are bacteriostatic, which means that you can add them to anything and they're not going to grow bacteria on them. Plenty of breweries dry hop with whole cone hops. They're not processed in any way other than drying your beer out because hops are not going to carry bacteria with them. You need to have special equipment in the commercial scale for using whole cone hops for dry hop, but there are plenty of breweries that do it, and there are some breweries like Deschutes that exclusively use whole cone hops. They don't use any pelletized hops, but you have to have special equipment to handle it because the cones get stuck in equipment really easily and they don't store as well. But for home, yeah, you can dump whole cones in there and it won't affect your beer negatively in any way. So if we go back to the whirlpool, we've pumped all of our wort in there, and any proteins that have broken out during the boil are going to collect in the middle. And then any additional hops that we've added to the whirlpool, because the whirlpool doesn't have any heat in it, it's just a holding vessel and a resting vessel. So if we dump more hops in there, we're going to get more aroma. So those hops are going to be another hop aroma addition. And then generally the beer waits in that tank for 20 or 30 minutes. And then we're ready to pump that from the whirlpool into one of our fermentation tanks. But we can't just go straight from there into the fermentation tanks. We have to cool it down. And the reason is because we're going to get to our last ingredient, which is yeast. And yeast is a living organism. It is a single-celled organism, and it does not like boiling sugar water. It will kill it. So we need to cool that down. So we're going to chill the wort down, generally through some type of heat exchanger. And a heat exchanger basically just looks like a radiator that has cold water going in on one side with a whole bunch of different plates, and the hot wort goes through on the other side. Oh, now Chewy's screwing with me. What are you doing with your cam?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
Did we lose our cam?
Oh, no, it shouldn't have gone away.
Yeah, we lost cam. See what happens when you invite a professional affiliate streamer to your unprofessional hobby stream?
I break everything. Sorry, chat.
Oh, man. All right, I'm going to turn Chewy's cam off. Seriously, can you believe this guy?
No, what a class disruptor, sitting here shooting spitballs at the teacher.
Patreon refund demanded. I might have to cancel your window and come back. Disconnect or
Reconnect
reconnect.
the call real quick.
Yeah, hold on
Yeah.
just a second.
Okay.
We're gonna come back? No. All right. Hold on just a second.
Hello?
Not satisfied with ruining his own stream, he has to ruin other people's streams.
Oh, man, it's just a curse. I ruin everything I do.
Do we have your cam back? I just see a loading window.
It should be there.
Oh, man.
Oh, you're killing me, Skype. New voice provider confirmed. Hello?
Where that Chewy at?
I see it in my window.
Oh, man. Now we're really in trouble.
Bamboozled again.
I got nothing. All right, let's try one more time.
Hello, please?
Can you believe this Chewy done? There's the Chewy. All right, let's get this reconfigured.
God damn it.
No more horsing around the back of class.
Sorry, Dad. I'll be quiet.
All right, let's see if that works.
I won't touch my computer anymore.
All right, we're good. Okay. So back to the subject at hand. Yeah, pop quiz with a guest. Yeah. All right. So we need to cool our wort down, and we're going to pump it into a fermentation vessel, and we're going to add the yeast. And we're also going to add oxygen because yeast needs oxygen to grow and reproduce. So this photo right here is 4 fermentation tanks, and you can see that they have a cone-shaped bottom, and these are temperature-controlled tanks. They have jackets on the outside of the. There's probably one jacket right up here in the middle that controls the temperature for this area, and then there's another jacket that controls the cone temperature. And we pump propylene glycol, chilled propylene glycol through the jackets to control the temperature. And the reason is that if yeast just fermented with no temperature control, we would get all kinds of crazy off flavors and aromas, and it would be really unpleasant. So we have to control the temperature that yeast ferments at. And in terms of yeast, and then the reason that these fermentation tanks are cone-shaped on the bottom is that once the yeast has done its fermentation and it goes dormant, it'll collect down in the bottom of those cones, and we can harvest it and use it for another batch of beer. So when we talk about yeast, there are 2 main families of yeast. There's ale yeast and there's lager yeast. And the most important difference between the 2 of them is the kinds of flavors that you get from fermentation from the yeast. So in very general terms, lager yeast works in cooler temperatures. It does most of its work on the bottom of the vessel, and it imparts a little bit less flavor into your beer because it works at cooler temperatures. And then in very general terms, ale yeast works generally at the top of the fermentation. It works at warmer temperatures, and it imparts a little bit more character into the beer than lager yeast does. Lager yeast is from the German and Czech tradition of brewing, and ale yeast is from the English tradition of brewing. And mainly that is because when, at the beginning of modern brewing times, they would store beer in caves in Germany before refrigeration. And they didn't even know what yeast was at that point. But they would make the sugar water, and it would get frothy on its own by some kind of magic or whatever. And they would scoop some of that froth out and add it to the next beer they made, and it would keep making beer. So before they even understood what yeast was, they were selecting for certain strains of yeast and wild bacteria just by the fact of this stuff worked, and they kept doing it over and over again. And lager yeast, they would put these beer in barrels and store them in caves, and the caves would be really cool, and the yeast that worked best in those cooler temperatures became lager yeast, essentially. And then in the English tradition, they didn't have lagering caves in the same way. They would their beers fermented a little bit warmer, and that yeast basically self-selected to be ale yeast over time. And just like with hops and just like with malt, there are dozens and dozens of different yeast strains, and they all do different things and behave in the beer differently. So if you want to think of the way that those yeasts work in a little bit different way, a brewer buddy of mine explained in a really great way. If you're working in an office that's air conditioned, and you can pretend like you're the lager yeast, you're in air conditioning, you're getting work done, you're typing all day long, but you're not really sweating, and you go home at the end of the day and there's not really any byproducts of the work that you've done. But if you are doing work out in the yard and you're mowing the lawn or whatever, and you're getting sweaty and you're getting a funk worked up, the byproducts of your work are all of that BO and whatever else you've made, and you're the ale yeast working outside. And the byproduct of your work is all that other stuff that you've done. So ale yeast, because it works at a warmer temperature, it produces esters and phenols, and all these other chemical compounds that lager yeast will produce if you ferment it at warmer temperatures as well. But those are in a lager they would be non-positive flavors, and in an ale they're positive flavors. So the yeast does behave differently. But the most important thing to remember is that typically lager yeast is going to impart less flavor, and typically ale yeast is going to impart more flavor. So we're brewing a beer. I didn't really talk about any time scale yet. Typically, it takes about 6 to 8 hours from the time that you crush in your grain and get it mashed in to the time that you've boiled it and cooled in and it's fermenting in the tank. So 6 to 8 hours to get that hot side done, essentially. And then the fermentation time is going to totally depend on what kind of beer you're making and what kind of yeast you're using, because those yeasts work at different times. If you're making an ale, typically that beer can be ready in as little as 15 days. Some ales are very fast. Excuse me. If you're making a lager, those beers typically take longer, like 4 to 6 weeks, because the lager yeast works different, and it takes longer to break down the sugars and to break down the other chemicals and compounds and stuff during fermentation. So beers anywhere between 15 days to 6 weeks, depending on the kind of beer you're making. If you're going to want to have a beer that has a really big hop aroma, like if you're making an IPA or a double IPA or some kind of beer that when you drink it, you're just like, holy shit, this has an incredible amount of hop aroma, you're going to wait until the majority of that fermentation is done. You're going to harvest your yeast either to use in another batch of beer or to dump down the drain. And then you're going to basically climb to the top of one of these tanks, and you're going to just dump a whole bunch more hops in the top and seal the whole tank up. And then the beer is going to rest on those hops for another 5 or 7 days, depending on your preferred method. And then you're going to crash cool that beer, cool it down to almost freezing, a little bit above freezing, and then either move it to a packaging tank, or you're going to filter it if you're a brewery that filters their beers, or you're going to centrifuge it if you're a brewery that uses centrifuge to get all of the yeast and everything out. But generally that's done on day 5 to day 7, depending on the kind of beer you're making, and that'll give you a really big hop aroma. And then you're going to want that beer to condition for a little bit. In ales, typically they don't need to condition for very long. They're typically ready to drink much sooner. But if you're making a lager, it's going to take, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks typically for that conditioning process to happen and for the flavors to mature and to even out. And then Giggle says, most of the times I brewed with different yeast, it mostly said to keep the fermentation to about 19C for the first part. And 19C, I want to say, is about 70 degrees. Let me just check the Googles real quick. 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So, Giggle, it's totally dependent on the yeast strain that you're using and how much temperature control you have. Because during the first little window of time, like the first maybe 12 hours, typically your yeast is not going to be throwing off any esters that would be indicative of a really warm fermentation. So if you're making a lager, you can do that first little window warm and then cool it down to your fermentation temp, which is typically for lagers, I'm going to say it's about 10C. Yeah, 10 to 12C, which is about 50 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. If you ferment warmer than that with almost any lager yeast, you're going to get esters and phenols that you don't want in your beer. They're going to be not flavor positive. So, depending on how much temperature control you have, you can start warm and then cool down. And then it just depends on how much temperature control you have, really. If you're making an ale, we ferment most of our beers at 67 degrees, which is 19C, 19 and a half C. So it's completely yeast dependent. Just depends on what you're doing and what kind of characteristics you want in the end. There's not one universal rule of thumb with yeast handling. So the beer's in the fermenter. If you've dry hopped it, it's going to age on those hops for a couple more days and get a big hop aroma. And then we're gonna want to separate out any hops that you've put in the tank, any residual yeast that's still in suspension in the liquid, or any other proteins or anything that are broken out, because we don't want to drink. Generally speaking, we don't want to drink really hazy, chunky beers. So we want to get those solids out of our beers. So some breweries will filter, where they pass a beer through some type of filtration, either membrane, or they use screens that are loaded up with diatomaceous earth, which is basically like crushed up seashells, or a synthetic version of it. And then some breweries, like our brewery, uses a centrifuge, which just spins the beer to separate the proteins and all that other stuff. And the philosophy behind it is that we just spent all of this time getting these amazing aromas and flavors into the beer. If you filter, you're also going to be filtering out some of those flavor and aromas. There's no getting around it.
Of course.
So,
of course.
If you centrifuge, you're not passing the beer through a filter, and you're just spinning off the solids. So some people prefer that method, which in our case we do, because there's higher yield out of the tanks than using a filter, and then there's also less flavor and aroma loss. But you want to get all those solids out of the beer because you want to have a bright beer, generally speaking. This picture that I just threw up is some of the outdoor fermenters at New Belgium in Fort Collins. Those previous pictures that we saw are about a 15 barrel tank, so you can think of that as like 30 kegs. These are, I think, 800 barrel fermenters, so obviously significantly bigger. But they are still conical tanks. It's a little bit difficult to see from this angle, but these diagonals right here are the bottoms of those cones that we just saw. But the scale is obviously enormous. So still cone-shaped tanks, but they're just a lot different scale than something much smaller like this. But the overall geometry is about the same. So, so now we have bright beer. How do they control the fermentation temps in those big silos? They're temperature controlled in just the same way that the small tanks are, but they just have much, much bigger jackets on the outside. So instead of having little tiny zones that control it, the jackets are just much bigger, and they surround the entire outside. And, this outside these are outside tanks, so this is cladding and weatherproof material for the whatever, so it doesn't get damaged. But there's jackets on the inside of this that control the temperature with all kinds of probes and stuff, because that's a enormous volume of beer, and you can't have all that fermenting at crazy temperatures. So what else? So packaging. So the beer is packaged, and depending on what you're making, it's either going to go into kegs or into bottles. So from whatever your next step past your clarification step is, either filtration or centrifuging, or many breweries don't do any kind of clarification. They just let the beer sit in the tank for a while, and all those solids will eventually settle out. But they go to a packaging tank or a bright tank, different name for it, and the beer generally gets carbonated in that tank. So there's some type of either ceramic stone or sintered steel, something that can make tiny little bubbles go into the beer. And you bubble CO2 through there, and that adds the carbonation. And that's how you get your bubbles into the beer. The yeast is producing CO2 as a byproduct of fermentation, and sometimes you can capture that and have the natural carbonation in the beer. But depending on your processing, like if you filter a carbonated beer, it generally doesn't filter very well. So in some cases, it's not practical to capture that. But if you have like a Belgian style beer that is carbonated in the bottle, they'll generally take that yeast that fermented the beer out, add a tiny little bit of sugar back, and add a little bit of yeast back, and then put it in the bottle, and then it ferments. It does a tiny little fermentation in the bottle, and that carbonation is what gives you your bottle conditioned beers. You're going to ask me something?
Yeah, like what, if you have the experience, like what is the flavor difference between a beer that has been bottled with its, I guess, grown in carbonation versus a beer that had carbonation added to it?
Um,
Like, is there a significant or?
Generally speaking, it's not so much a flavor difference, but it's a fineness of the bubbles. Natural carbonation, because the carbonation is literally coming off of a yeast cell, it gives you extremely fine, tiny little bubbles. And natural,
Mm,
when you force carbonate a beer, there's not really a way to get that same fineness of carbonation in the beer. So the bubbles tend to be a little bit coarser, a little bit bigger. Sometimes they'll dissipate a little bit more easily once you've opened the beer. But a bottle conditioned beer, if you crack that open and pour it into a glass, you're going to have extremely fine, tiny little bubbles that often last a very long time. And forced carbonated beers are just a little bit bigger bubbles and they're not as delicate. That's the main difference
would you
between
say
the two.
it's almost like a condition like champagne, kind of?
Yeah, because champagne is conditioned in the bottle. So you get those tiny, very fine bubbles.
Oh.
And uh, mostly in bottle conditioned beers, you're going to be having like a Belgian style beer. It's not going, there's not a ton of, um, uh, there's not a ton of non Belgian style beers that are bottle conditioned. It's mostly for extremely fancy style beers. But there's,
Mm,
it's a lot more work to do that, and there's a lot more variables, so you don't see it as frequently. But it's not very difficult to find a bottle conditioned beer. It's just for certain. It's typically for certain styles.
sure.
Uh,
Sounds fancy.
it is, and then if you're not going to bottle your beer, either the beer gets put into a bottle or it generally gets put into a keg. Those are the two main ways of packaging your beer. And then for a keg is going to either go to a draft system like at a bar or a party or whatever else. But those are the two main ways to package your beers. Um, and then yeah, you've got your that's pretty much beer from start to finish. So it's once it's packaged, it's ready to be consumed.
Jeez.
I know.
What a what a lesson.
What about?
That was quite a lot of
I
info.
don't see any more questions right away from chat. I guess if you guys have anything else before we jump over to the um, small little beer and video game section that I have to add, I'll give you guys just another second. Otherwise, we'll transition over. Um, Obviously, this is on Twitch, and Twitch more than anything is about video games, which it should be.
Hmm.
But
Indeed.
let's see. Let me switch our tabs. Oh, you know what? I had this video queued up and I forgot to show it. Sorry, class. Here's a video of kind of a hard to see video, but this is a brewery mashing in. So there's hot water dumping in, and there's grain being dumped in, and it's getting stirred up together. I thought I'd show it, but I totally forgot to bring that video up. But it basically looks like a giant vat of hot oatmeal. So, but if I switch over here, so I alluded to this last night when Chu and I were playing Overwatch, but um, for a company that is detailed, as detailed driven and detailed focused as Blizzard,
Oh yeah, no, Brewer was fucking furious about this last night.
I don't understand this setup in the spawn. So this is the spawn map in Eichenwald. Um, you're in a beer hall basically, and they have what I can only assume are these brewing vessels, but the brewing vessels to me don't make any sense at all, and I can't get why Blizzard did this. So first of all, they all have stacks, which totally makes sense, which is that central part where your exhaust is going to go. But then they have these secondary stacks on the side with pressure gauges, which doesn't make any sense at all because these are not pressure vessels. You can't have a pressure on your mash. You can have a little bit of back pressure on a mash or on a boil kettle, maybe, but it's not super practical. And they have three of these vessels, and they're identical. Like the stacks are slightly different on one, but it's three of the exact same vessel. So it doesn't make any sense. And in the exceedingly rare chance that anybody from Blizzard ever sees this video, maybe I'll get an answer. But they do such a great job on so many things. I didn't understand why they wouldn't just ask a brewer like the simplest question.
With
Like, hey,
with
did
all
these
the craft breweries in
yeah,
California too, you would think that
did these
it
three
wouldn't be that
vessels
hard.
did these three vessels make any sense at all? Like, no, no, guys, no, they really don't. Like, even if they were stills, they wouldn't be pressure vessels like that. So that's my that's my tiny little beer and video game chat for the beer school. Um, the the one thing that I really hope that we can do when we do this, I hope next time. Let me see if I can pull this up. Is this going to work for us? Rip, my phone's not even broadcasting now. Mirror link connected. Are we good?
Well, oh, the darkness takes us, chat.
I know. Let me try to pull this back up. I thought my mirroring was working, and it was working so well last time. I had it all worked out.
Do not be afraid, chat. We are with you. Yeah, see, we're back.
Okay. No, I don't care about that. Rip, I opened up the free version instead of the paid version.
Rip.
Pro. Let's get that going.
Oh,
So
the joys of streaming.
there's this really great there's this really great app called Draft Lab, and it is a joint tasting app basically. Mirroring is paused. I don't want you to pause. I want you to mirror. Do my mirroring for me. Do it.
Just talk dirty to it.
I know. I don't want you to stop. I want you to go. Nope. Rip. Come on. Come on, come on. Do it for me. Do it. Do it. Man, this is a bummer.
Don't be afraid, chat.
I totally had this working before.
Try.
There we go. There we go. We did it.
Oh.
Okay, let me switch over. Okay, so this is a app called Draft Lab, and it is developed by a friend of mine that works at New Belgium. She started this with somebody else, and it is for evaluating beers. So if this is the Beer 101 class, what I hope to do in the future is to get maybe 3 beers that are easily available that whomever else wants to join in, Chewy, if you come back and do this again, or whomever comes and does this with me, we'll get 3 beers that we can just go to the store and buy, and I will walk you guys through how to do beer evaluation. So it's not about rating beers, but it's about how to taste beers and how to evaluate beers. And this app is a really cool way to do this. So let me pull a version of this up. So what happens is you come up with a beer. We'll just call it beer XYZ for right now. And it will give me a code. And I share the code with everybody. And for this one, the code's going to be AA, looks like 0Z3. And so everybody opens their app and they put in this code and it pulls everything together. And then you get to just go through all of the different parts of the beer and evaluate what it is. So if you're looking at your beer and you want to pick the color, there's a nice little slider bar that you just move back and forth and say, yes, it's either this, or no, it goes all the way down to here, very black opaque. And it's super easy to use. And I've used this app before with a beer school with some friends that have never used it before, and they all found it super intuitive and easy to use. But the thing that's I think is really great about it is beyond the very basic stuff like color and whatever else. I find that a lot of people have a very difficult time expressing what they like in a beer or don't like in a beer, and adjectives and ways to say something other than I just don't like it, or it sucks, or it tastes like butts, or whatever else. So if you pull up aromas, you have all of these different categories that come up that you can choose from that are potential like families of aromas that you can experience in a beer. So we were talking about a dry hop being a really big hoppy aromatic properties. So what are those aromas? Are they fruity? Are they spicy? Are they burnt? So if we go into fruity, there's all this other stuff that you can pick. It can be tropical fruit, it can be berry, it can be coconut, it could be a pear, some other kind of stone fruit. And you just go through and click whatever ones that you think that it tastes like. And then it generates all of these different characters and aggregates them so that once everybody has gone through and tasted the beer, we get this really cool map that everybody can look at that describes aromas and tastes and mouthfeels. So
Those ripe options, though, I mean, that sewage beer looked awful delicious.
I've tasted sewage characters in beers before, and it is not pleasant. Um, so it definitely comes up, but I think this is a really cool way to uh, to not only get people to understand what they're tasting and smelling in beers, but just a really cool educational tool. And we actually use the professional version of this at work when we're evaluating beers. So it's a really cool tool and it's free. And so the next time that we do beer school, my intention is to get everybody to download this ahead of time. And I will publish what beers that we're going to try way ahead of time, so everybody has a chance to get them at their local store or whatever, and then we'll do a joint tasting and evaluation of the beers, and I think it will be really cool, and hopefully people will be into it.
Sounds like good fun.
Anything else that I forgot? I realized that went a little bit longer than what we intended, but
I'd let people know where they can find you and get more information about beer school ahead of time.
yeah, we can definitely do some shout outs. You want to go first, and then I'll wrap it up for us?
Oh, sure. My name's Chuydon. I'm a variety broadcaster here on Twitch. Makes more on myself. A lot of my fam here in the chat. Thank you for supporting one of our fellow friends. I hope you guys enjoy beer school. Thanks for having me. There's a lot of great information, cleared up some of my misconceptions about how brewing is, and very interesting just coming from the coffee industry and being involved in coffee for a long time, the similarities and flavor profiling and all that kind of stuff. So just cool experience. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you for coming. If you guys are interested in beer school and you dug it, you can follow me on Twitter at brewer_a, here on Twitch at twitch.tv/brewer_a. And I think the best place for me to post beer school information is going to be on my Twitch page, in the details, in the bio, and I'll post all the stuff there. So if you're looking for it, hopefully we can pick another date sometime soon and get some people involved, and I think it'll be really fun. So
Sounds great.
all right,
Thanks again.
thank you guys. We will I'm going to switch over. Chewy, I assume you're going to jump in and do some streams tonight.
Yeah, there'll be some streaming going on tonight, so I'll probably figure out something fun to play here in a minute.
All right. I'll throw a host over to Chewy's channel, and thank you guys for coming by. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you guys.
Bye.